An open letter from the Rocky Mountains, 13th of April 2016, Montana, USA. Quote, palm trees swayed gently in the dappled sunlight as the languid surf inside the coral reef caressed a crescent of white sand. The timeless vision of an idyllic South Sea paradise was marred by the fleet of 95 warships anchored in the lagoon. The ghost fleet was completely devoid of human presence, but not devoid of life. As the ships swung gently on their anchor chains, the only sound one could imagine would be the insistent bleating of the herds of goats and sheep that had replaced the sailors on deck, and perhaps the excited cries of 5,000 lab rats in their cages as they smelled the bags of corn seed that were stowed topside. The humid atmospherics foreshadow a macabre sea story worthy of a Jack London or Joseph Conrad. A lone high-altitude B-29 approached the Bikini Atoll on July 1st of 1946, less than 1 year after the Japanese surrender in World War II. The plane carried a plutonium Fat Man implosion weapon identical to the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The small plutonium core of the Bikini weapon had previously killed 2 scientists in a Los Alamos laboratory, who both made careless, repetitive mistakes in handling the material, resulting in critical bursts of lethal radiation. Descending deeper into the stranger-than-fiction genre, we find that the bomb was named Gilda, after the ultimate femme fatale character played by Rita Hayworth in the 1946 film noir of the same name. Gilda was the favorite pin-up girl of millions of GIs during World War II. Her picture was plastered on the side of the bomb alongside the stenciled name, Gilda. Ground zero for Gilda was the battleship Nevada, which sported a fresh coat of red-orange paint as a giant bullseye for the B-29 Bombardier. Even with the excellent northern bomb sight, Gilda had a mind of her own and missed the target by 847 yards. You might say that half a mile was good enough for government work, but the reason for the debacle eluded a congressional investigation, which could not determine who to blame or what went wrong. Even though the Navy's careful plans to measure the nuclear weapons' effect on the sacrificial fleet were somewhat scrambled, there was still enough prompt radiation from the 520 feet airburst to sap the ships and their cargo. Plant scientists were exceedingly happy to retrieve the radiated corn seeds and fly them to a secret government facility near Washington, D.C. A portion of the spoils was sent to Caltech and immediately planted at the Arcata Farm site in Southern California. Plant geneticists had been bombarding seed with X-rays for decades, trying to provoke unknown mutations to study. Now they had an opportunity for the real thing. A Caltech document heralds the result. Quote, the world's worst corn crop, end of quote. The mutated crop was so stunted and bizarre that the Bikini seed was eventually relegated to the Maize Genetics Cooperation Stock Center in Urbana, where it languished until, quoting USDA Ag Research magazine, quote within quote, one day in 1959, University of Illinois scientist John Laugnan absent-mindedly popped dry corn kernels into his mouth while shelling mutant seeds of cobs. He was surprised by the sweetness of one of the kernels from a particular mutant obtained from the university's Maize Genetics Cooperation Stock Center in Urbana. That particular mutant was known as Shrunken 2. Its shriveled up kernels became what the world now knows as super sweet corn. End of quote within the quote. Laugnan was a geneticist, but his eyes were seeing dollar signs as he excitedly planted the mutant code-named Shrunken 2, SH2 for short, seed which barely germinated because of the high sugar content. He eventually crossed the mutant corn with older traditional varieties to gain a better germination rate and rushed to the market in 1961 with Illini Extra Sweet and an extra sweet version of Golden Cross Bantam. In the late 1960s, another University of Illinois scientist, Ashby Rhodes, discovered yet another extra sweet mutant that was also extra tender. It was marketed as Sugar Enhanced, SE for short, and soon had many followers. In the rush to stoke America's sweet tooth and rake in hundreds of millions of dollars, our grandfather's heirloom varieties lapsed into obscurity. Major seed companies moved to capture world food production in the 1990s as genetic engineering came online. As part of that coordinated effort, the mad scientists took the SH2 and the SE mutations and genetically stacked yet more mutations together to arrive at the quote-unquote augmented super sweet corn, which would exhibit any gastronomic trait that an obese and sweet-addicted public could possibly savor. I call it true Frankencorn, a worthy food for the good Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory. My friends, I share this story to provide some small understanding as to why I stopped growing sweet corn and started planting and developing our alpine varietal of painted mountain corn. We grow protein, not sugar. Joe Robinson broke the corn backstory in Eating on the Wild Side. She said that 95% of all sweet corn grown today has those bikini mutations. I would add my suspicion that almost all corn has cross-pollination GMO contaminants. That's why we grow our seed at remote locations in the mountains of Montana, far from any other corn. I also have a little skin in the game and some sins to atone for. Back in the late 1950s, I was in a military unit that was scheduled to deploy to the Yucca Flats nuclear test site in Nevada when they were still doing open-air detonations. We were going to be the human guinea pigs in trenches located in some proximity to Ground Zero. Fortunately, we stood down at the last minute for reasons I never knew. A few years later, I took a year off from university to work in a medical school radiochemistry lab. What I saw there was a real eye-opener. Aside from medical students routinely selling their blood to pay the rent, indignant patients were recruited off the streets and rewarded with a small sum of money to spend a few days in the hospital and receive injections of radioactive isotopes for experiments in the name of science. We lowly technicians were encouraged to bring a brown bag lunch to the weekly faculty seminar. I stopped going because what I heard killed my appetite. As the presenter got into the details of his research that required the patient to be restrained while a huge horse needle was inserted into the sternum to extract some interesting bone marrow. The presenter would drone on for a while and get my attention again when he would remark with true morbid detachment, quote within quote, "Unfortunately, the patient expired. Next slide, please." End of the quote within the quote. After a year, I got out of that lab and never looked back. Much later, in another career phase, I found myself designing and building blast and radiation shelters, and had the opportunity to meet several of the physicists who designed the original nuclear weapons. Although rather aged at that time, they still had formidable intellects and certainly knew how to defend against the weapons they developed. Currently, we are faced with dangers that are more acute than at the height of the Cold War due to the events at Fukushima and the proliferation of nuclear weapons and fissile materials. There is an increasing crescendo of nuclear memes that are purposely injected into the mass media to prepare us for something looming near, whether terrorist dirty bombs, false flag attacks, or EMP events. In retrospect, I can say that I don't think we are wise enough yet, as a people, to use nuclear energy for any purpose. But we can't stuff the genie back in the bottle, so we must pray up, prepare, and be aware of soulless scientists who would destroy and enslave us.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Hello and welcome to the Return of the Repressed, dear listeners. So glad to sit down on my cushion with you again. Spring is coming and we are back to the topic of agriculture, which feels great. What you just heard in the intro was a written story by one of the last heirloom corn growers in Montana's Rocky Mountains. An old man who must be very old by now, since he was involved in radioactive war experiments in the 1950s. He writes with the help of declassified documents from the Department of Defense and the Defense Technical Information Center, as well as primary sources from Caltech. There is so much that I want to talk about that I even started writing a parallel series about the mythology of the Holodomor. And towards the end of the episode, I'll be telling you about other half-finished scripts that I wish to get through this year. This scattered nature of my ambitions might make today's introductory a little bit messy. Add to this the fact that I had a 4-day weekend when my wife went to see a friend from Okinawa who has a son the same age as ours. And being home alone, I might have had a glass too much of Friday evening red wine to properly record. Evidently so, since I had to cut away parts the next day when I'm just ranting and crying. But what is left should be at least coherent, despite its intensive engagement on my part. Now, getting into the intention of this series. It must be stated that there is something extremely interesting about corn. By my definition, it was the first truly reified agricultural crop made to fit the logic of capitalism. I'm talking here about the F1 semi-sterile nature of hybridization, which for the first time ever forced farmers to return to the seed sellers. A breakthrough to an age-old problem of the merchants, which is often obscured as a scientific breakthrough, when in reality it is merely a breakthrough of bookkeeping and intellectual property rights of the agro-political economy. This obscuration will be the initial topic of today's episode, followed in the second episode by a historical backdrop which explains why it had to be performed. But there are also other interesting things about corn, as the intro suggests, and we will see that the delicious sweetness of thermonuclear war is not the only thing that might or might almost have you believe in some perverse synchronicity of the natural Weltgeist, though we know that it is, of course, the brain damage of certain scientists. I have mentioned Khrushchev's sweet tooth for corn before and the dust bowls of Kazakhstan. I've tweeted about the initial prototypical CMC circulation of corn by the Aztecs and the Mayans, which eventually necessitated the baby blood rituals and human sacrifices of the maize daemon, one of the many early avatars of the real god of capital. Hopefully, we will be able in this series to say all that needs to be said about this interesting, very useful plant, and perhaps we can also throw in some early communism curiosities of its deep historical development, as to not only make this a bleak critique. Now, among the many secrets that it possesses, let's begin tonight's episode, as just suggested, by unraveling something about the common mistake of pursuing a royal road to science when we are actually faced with nothing other than the degradation of capital reification of plant commodities.
The future of this country and the lives of our children and our children's children are interwoven with the success of the United Nations. In it lies the hope of the people of the world. My father considers it a privilege to have had a part in the development of its permanent home. I'm glad to hand you this lead on this chat.
Thank you, Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller. The United Nations extends its sincere thanks to you and to your father for this magnificent gift. We intend to move ahead and create on the history beside a dignified and appropriate headquarters for the United Nations, which will stand.
We are constantly told that green yields have been increasing throughout the 1900s, which they very well might have depending on how you read the stats. But that's not the point. Because even in books that might involve terminology like neocolonialism, post-colonialism, the Cold War of genetics, etc., and which presents itself as a researched critique of our contemporary organization of agricultural science, often add in a conspicuously seamless way the claim that this upward trend primarily began in the 1950s. An unproven correlation is often hinted at or directly stated when putting it in this manner, as this was the decade of the quote-unquote discovery of DNA or the quote-unquote century of the gene, when, as I have tried to make clear on numerous occasions, the great private foundations, Ford, DuPont, Carnegie, Rockefeller, et al., began in earnest to gradually take control of the Western and satellite colonial knowledge production and its apparatuses of fundamental research. The labs, the test fields, the experimental industries, the academic publishing houses, etc., were staffed with people recruited to represent the bourgeois project of a quote-unquote world science known as the modern synthesis, which focused the formal gaze of natural science on the level of the submicroscopic, effectively orientating the spontaneous philosophy of biology around a molecular vision of life with an impossible object of desire at its core, of course. We know this. We have been here before. We have been here many times. But there are a couple of problems with the appreciated, or taken for granted, since we are really dealing with a spontaneous philosophy after all, historical correlation. First off, if yields really only began to surge in the 1950s right after the war, surely fundamental research, which usually predates application by decades, at times even centuries, cannot be so easily equated with a direct causality or even as one of many overdetermined causes. The cause, as it were, must simply lie elsewhere. Furthermore, there is something even more problematic regarding this positivist naive hope, which when it wants to live up to its ideological origins, putting the classical in classical liberalism, so to say, often layers on top of this unproven correlation another unproven correlation. It is perhaps the capitalist axiom par scientific excellence, or at least a good candidate. That is to say that the world finally, after hundreds of thousands of years, really began improving in the 1950s onwards because modern science finally began to inform the economic base of agriculture. And modern science finally began to inform the economic base of agriculture because the superstructural productivity of science was industrially organized by the world's richest industrialists. The claim of this apologetic relationship is already inherent in my way of putting it. And Lebensphilosophie sociologists of the second half of the 19th century had already been recruited in mass to presume this to be a good thing long before it became a thing. But if one was to stop and read the arguments for why Rockefeller or IG Farben should be in control of fundamental research from the time when they were not yet in control of it, one would have to ask oneself why this entrepreneurial nature of instinct and intuition, which arguably by its very definition is the antithesis of rational objective experimentation, should nonetheless be allowed to lead the way. What the moralist bourgeois-aligned aristocracy had more crudely called egoism before the revolution in 1789, and which suggested, with accuracy, I might add, that technical and industrial productivity was the highest goal of their involvement in fundamental research. No other historical bloc, the story goes, ever mandated to organize science and experimentation as such, have had more real incentive to more efficiently bridge the gap between promising theoretical propositions and the practical implementation of such hypotheses, as manifested technological means of production, technical modules of organizing the conditions of production, technical understanding to reproduce and expand the efficiency of such conditions and their means, etc. At least, that is what positivists interpolated us to believe. And indeed, on such fundamental levels of cognition, the dispositivist hope of, quote-unquote, another solution will always already be just around the corner is often taken as the a priori attitude of a scientist which makes modern experimentation possible at all. But why then do even their own economistic input-output modules recently, now in the age of the bourgeois hangover, formulate statistical, historical trends of a different kind? The American Economic Association, in one of their publications called The American Economic Review, a paper which since its 19th century origins have been traditionally dominated by 7 major universities: Johns Hopkins, Harvard, MIT, Chicago, Columbia, Stanford, and Princeton. Which I only mention to highlight that we can, considering these institutions' self-evident legitimacy, read this report symptomatically, though they of course do not state it, as a form of self-critique of the hegemonic politico-economical order of things. For these were, of course, at least in the American setting, the institutions at the time of the association's founding which promoted this positivist Lebensphilosophie with greatest fervor. That which the French aristocrats around the gambling table had 100 years before once again called egotism, which the non-continental British called utilitarianism, and which the Americans of primarily Johns Hopkins and Harvard called pragmatism, and what I, inspired by Lukács, recognize as the irrational fetishization of intuition by the Homo economicus. In a paper from 2020 called, quote, "Are Ideas Getting Harder to Find?" end of quote, they published a long series of graphs which, as stated above, generally looks at input, which according to them is to be constituted of labor, capital and technologies, and output, which is goods and services of the market. Bog standard bourgeois thought, nothing special going on here. Simply put, how profitable is research? Is the basic question which they are doing their best to quantify. Furthermore, this paper was, as far as I can tell, initially funded by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the major institution or rotating door between NGOs and that American state apparatus known as the Council of Economic Advisors, which is the high governmental instance most famous for prophesizing the start and end dates of recessions in the United States, i.e., the Mano-astrological roundtable of economic wizardry. That rotating door, the National Bureau of Economic Research, was initially set up by the aforementioned foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, etc., in the early days of the 20th century. I believe later this is where Milton Friedman first made a name for himself. And again, I am not telling you this because I am especially interested in Friedman's coming of age or his inner life. It's only that these graphs are so fucked up that even if you are sympathetic to the negation of the ultimate cause, as I know many of you are, some even productively and politically organized so, I still need to make clear again that this is symptomatically a self-critique by the enemy, not a critique by our camp. And as we say in Sweden, stolen fruit is always the tastiest. The most general graphs at the beginning of the paper are already seriously interesting. This is a podcast, so I can't show them to you, but I will start linking stuff again if you want to take a look yourself. But I'll make it as easy as possible. We have two lines. The first is the quote-unquote total factor productivity, or TFP. An IMF term, I believe, designating quote-unquote fundamental productivity, according to some of their theorists. The TFP line is already showing the beginning of a decline, though slight, during the 40s and 50s, when the world's biggest businessmen hijacked the apparatuses of fundamental research with their industrial contracts, grants, and lab scholarships, etc. the previous decade, which was basically that of war communism and rations in America, which is even how the Austrian School of Economics had to state it in some of their analysis more than half a century ago, seems to have represented the only increase during the entire century, which was signified overall by stagnation. And stagnation might be a good thing insofar that it is one of stability, had it not been for the fact that the second line on this graph shows the number of researchers skyrocketing after the 50s. So what gives? More researchers but less productivity? Question mark. Some out there will say that war is good for productivity and research. We will deal with debunks of popular causes in a while. However, this graph seems to suggest preparation for war, or maybe rather the New Deal of government spending. Perhaps even anti-monopoly unity among broad sectors of the American classes. Not war, as the drop already begins in the 40s. But even such explanations might be problematic assumptions, hinted at by the paper itself. Because remember, we are presuming almost half a century of delay when it comes to fundamental research, though of course they also got up to other kinds of more practical sciences. The next graph is more complicated and titled, quote-unquote, research productivity, which is the ratio of idea output measured as TFP growth to research effort, whatever that means, but it shows basically the same thing. Only more extreme is the drop from the hijack onwards, and the stability and stagnation is gone. It's all drop. Then comes some interesting, specifically agricultural graphs that I suggest we take a look at for the sake of this intro. The first set of graphs are, as stated in the papers, filled with statistics that are literally plagued by shocks, which makes the line look aggressively spiky. A lot of up and downs, kind of like Bitcoin or something. Maybe it should be called Bitcoin harvesting rather than Bitcoin mining, as the rise and drop, the pump and dump, get more aggressive. These shocks, especially adverse weather and pest events, tend to have asymmetric effects. Adverse events cause much larger reductions in yields than favorable events increase them, as indicated by the many large one-year reductions followed by recoveries in the figure. For this, see Wallace Huffman, Yu Jin, and Cheng Xu, The Economic Impacts of Technology and Climate Change, New Evidence from U.S. Corn Yields, published in 2016. Nevertheless, yields across these big four crops, corn, cotton, soybean and wheat, roughly doubled between 1960 and 2015, which is the usual trend we are offered statistically when asked to appreciate and measure for ourselves the effects of the Green Revolution, which was ushered in towards the end of the 50s and throughout the 60s onwards. The comparison seems indisputable and self-evident when considering these kinds of doublings of yields of the four major industrial agricultural crops of bourgeois society between 1960 and 2015. They never say anything about how much land has been rendered utterly useless for future centuries' yields and their increases, and how long this trend could possibly last, considering the ultimate finitude of available land which is then simultaneously being destroyed. But never mind that right now, for we are focusing on agriculture's relationship to agricultural, modern, biotech science, to see if it had an effect on the increased yields like the proponents of the Green Revolution says it does. And here comes the stats which majorly fucks with this interpretation, provided again by the enemy itself. So I believe it's best that I provide the honey directly from the bees within the imperial lion's skull. Quote, Figure 6 shows the annualized averaged 5-year growth rate of yields after smoothing to remove shocks mostly due to weather. Yield growth has averaged around 1.5% per year since 1960 for these 4 crops, but with ample heterogeneity. These 5-year growth rates serve as our measure of idea output in studying the idea production function for seed yields. The green lines in figure 6 shows measures of the quote-unquote effective number of researchers working on each crop, measured as the sum of public and private R&D spending, deflated by the wage of high-skilled workers. 2 measures are presented. The faster rising number corresponds to research targeted only at so-called biological efficiency. This includes crossbreeding, hybridization, and genetic modification directed at increasing yields, both directly and indirectly via improving insect resistance, herbicide tolerance, and efficiency of nutrient uptake, for example. The slower growing number additionally includes research on crop protection and maintenance, which includes the development of herbicides and pesticides. The effective number of researchers has grown sharply since 1969, rising by a factor that ranges from 3 to more than 25, depending on the crop and the research measure. And here comes the conclusive kicker. Quote, It is immediately evident from figure 6 that research productivity has fallen sharply for agricultural yields. Yield growth is relatively stable or even declining, while the effective research that has driven this yield growth has risen tremendously. Research productivity is simply the ratio of average yield growth divided by the number of researchers. End of quote in its entirety. Ouch! That can't be good at all for our contemporary imperialism's White House diarchy, since it consists, on the most superficial ideological level, of one man who is the world's smartest businessman ever, and another man who is the world's smartest rocket scientist ever. And by comparison, for more than half a century, men just like them of similar mandates, i.e. researchers and men of economical power, have been put into a room together to solve the age-historical problems of agricultural yield, and despite being allowed to call for as much backup as they like, nothing seems to have come of it. The quote-unquote research productivity of this, the best of formulas, is even declining. Strange. Very strange. In Table 2, entitled Research Productivity by Crop 1969-2009, we can read as it follows. Corn, average growth 7.8% in terms of effective research. However, research productivity is down minus 9.9%. Soybeans, average growth 7.9%. However, research productivity is down minus 7.3%. Cotton, 5.9% on average growth. However, average growth of research productivity is down minus 3.4%. Wheat, again, plus 4.5% and then minus 6.1%. And if we were to do the broader estimates, which includes crop protection, we find 4.2% of corn and then minus 6.2%. And in soybeans we find plus 5% and then minus 4.4%. And then in cotton 1.3% and then actually plus 1.3%. And then wheat 1.7% and then minus 3.3%. Only cotton has, under certain statistical definitions, experienced a increase of research productivity in its average growth. Now, spontaneously, that seems like improving the lives of southern sub-proletarian slaves having become day laborers, to the extent that this was done during the civil rights movements in the 60s, might have had a positive effect on productivity. But that is just a thought of my own. Let's see where the authors of the paper goes with this.
I hear something saying, That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. All day long they're saying, That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. All day long they work so hard till the sun is going down, working on the highways and byways and wearing a frown. You hear them moaning their lives away, then you hear somebody say, that's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. Can't you hear them saying, I'm going home one of these days. I'm going home, see my woman whom I love so dear. But meanwhile, I've got to work right here. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. All day long they're saying, my work is so hard, give me water, I'm thirsty, my work is so hard, whoa, my work is so hard.
It states in conclusion, on average, research productivity declines for crop yields by about 6% per year using the narrow definition of research, and by about 4% per year using the broader definition. This trend of declining research productivity follows the graphs of the second and last section of the paper, carrying names such as research productivity for new molecular entities. And by this they mean synthetic molecule strings that can be patented and sold as drugs. Again, decline. Research productivity for medical research. Decline. Cancer all types. Decline. And heart disease. Decline. Decline, decline, decline. Attacking assumptions about modern science is one of the, if not the, most difficult forms of ideological critiques one can engage in, and it is often best to consult scientists of the specific fields themselves. The late Richard Levantine, the American Marxist geneticist and biologist who have come to our aid many times before on this podcast, says in a series of public radio lectures during the beginning of the Human Genome Project in the 1990s that, quote, "The first function of science is manipulating the material world by producing a set of techniques, practices, and inventions by which new things are produced and by which the quality of our lives is changed. The second function of science, which is sometimes independent and sometimes closely related to the first, is the function of explanation. Yet it is remarkable how much important practical science has been quite independent of theory. The most famous examples of scientific agricultural change is the introduction of hybrid corn all over the world. Hybrid corn is said to be one of the great triumphs of modern genetics in action, helping to feed people and increase their well-being. Yet the development of hybrid corn, and indeed almost all plant and animal breeding as it is actually practiced, has been carried out in a way that is completely independent of any scientific theory. Indeed, a great deal of plant and animal breeding has been done in a way indistinguishable from the methods of past centuries before anyone had ever heard of genetics. The same is true for our attempts to cope with killers like cancer and heart disease. Most cures for cancer involve either removing the growing tumor or destroying it with powerful radiation or chemicals. Virtually none of this progress in cancer therapy has occurred because of a deep understanding of the elementary processes of cell growth and development, although nearly all cancer research, above the purely clinical level, is devoted precisely to understanding the most intimate details of cell biology. Medicine remains, despite all the talk of scientific medicine, essentially an empirical process in which one does what works." End of quote. This is the dichotomy between evidence-based practice and experience-based practice which is unfolding all around us to this very day. And this quote comes from one of his many introductions, and as such, it is fitting for an intro, but we will deepen this understanding as we go along this spring to show exactly what kind of science helped with the yield increases and what kind of science have diluted the effort and caused the quote-unquote research productivity to plummet. You might have some suspicions already, I'm sure. Another closely related phenomenon of science in general was revealed by a study that appeared in Nature last year, with data from 45 million papers that were published worldwide, which sought to find out how, quote-unquote, disruptive or bound-breaking science has been recently. Are we stuck in Hegel's quantitative gradualism, or do we live in an era characterized by Hegel's qualitative suddenness? Which is my formulation of the question, obviously. Nature would never put it like that. Sabine Hosenfelder, a German doctor of physics who has authored the book Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray, another title which I have touched upon before with regards to the aesthetics of the double helix, says the following, quote, "They quantified the disruptiveness of a paper by how many earlier works were made redundant by it. Using this measure, they found that the number of disruptive ideas has noticeably gone down in many areas of science, including the physical sciences, chemistry, computer science, and biomedicine. This is the case even in top journals such as Nature and Science." End of quote. She then goes on to talk about the problem in general. Quote, one can criticize all that research for the particular measure of novelty or innovation or disruptiveness or whatever they called it, but what makes this so convincing and so worrying is that regardless of how they looked at it, they always find the same thing. When it comes to research, we are making increasingly more effort for less in return. You might say now, how can it possibly be that we have a lack of progress if the world is changing so fast? Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, nuclear fusion, autonomous vehicles, brain implants. Yes, hold that thought, because those technologies aren't based on any recent breakthrough discoveries. They are based on breakthroughs that are decades old, that are only now getting close to application, after more than half a century of research and development. I don't mean to belittle this work, but the slow pace and the enormous investments required are not counterexamples for the problem. They are an illustration of it. End of quote. And in my opinion, if they are, as she says, counterexamples for the problem, of course we should never have let businessmen who can only jump from one quarterly report to another, and as such can only think within such bubbles, nonetheless be allowed to organize the longue durée of the general intellect. Big data which demands not only 5-year plans, but 50-year plans, as suggested in that best-selling Chinese hard science fiction book, Three-Body Problem, by author Liu Siqin. And maybe that is why Sabine Hosenfelder, who is definitely not a communist, nonetheless claims in some of her essays and videos on YouTube that the only state which seems to understand this problem and has done something to stop it with success is China. She doesn't seem to like that at all, but maybe she should just start learning physics in Chinese instead. Despite her lack of faith, she does a good job of debunking some assumptions about the cause. First, according to her, the general trend described so far does not exclusively relate to the moon landing and the end of the space race, since the trend is observable outside America, nor does the Soviet trend mimic the American as much as one would like if this was the case. She doesn't mention that last part because I'm pretty sure she thinks the state as such is the problem. Furthermore, tackling another argument, it is wrong to assume that intellectual productivity must be treated differently than manual productivity, as if scientific insight has to wait for some kind of divine inspiration. This is a surprisingly sober point coming from a scientist, which as a class seldomly likes to recognize themselves as blue-collar workers when the world's richest pay their bills. In other words, more researchers could and should increase research productivity, even though lately it has ceased to do that within the bourgeois apparatuses of knowledge production. In addition, more researchers should at least definitely not decrease the level of novelty and disruptiveness as described in the closely related trend. But again, under this competitive, reifying order of things, it does, as scientific discovery becomes indistinguishable from commodity circulation. Another common-held assumption is that this is simply how human knowledge functions, and all the low-hanging fruit have been picked. But if that was the case, how come it all happened during the same time for so many different trees of knowledge, be it economic sectors, agriculture, drug development, chemistry, biomedicine, etc., even in different countries? Leaving Sabine's answers aside for a while, I think this defeatist and reductionist assumption about human nature misses another near absolute event, which we have already hinted at, one which is often missed or confused by those who like to speak about human nature when talking about the necessity of this near absolute event in general, or the impossibility of its negation. And as Marx pointed out with reference to Hegel's Science of Logic in Kapital, Volume 1, Kapital has this perverse talent of utilizing a dialectical inversion by which it turns the mere quantitative differences into qualitative distinctions. If I was to explain that with an example, as I often feel forced to do, I would say that ever since General Electric received the first ever patent on a bacteria in the 1980s, Kapital has known that 10 bullshit scientific discoveries are worth more on the market bundled together than one true scientific discovery. That is to say, those 10 bullshit scientific discoveries due to that dialectical inversion of reification collectively transformed their mere quantitative differences into one qualitative distinction. It is like people such as Jung Chan, who tries to appear scientific by filling up half their published books with notes and bibliographies, even though when you take a look at the sources individually, it's just her talking to someone she knows who has an opinion on Mao Zedong. It's like the way Ryan Gosling explained the 2008 crisis in The Big Short. Though, as I just indicated, Marx and Hegel already did that, but before the computer. It is not as sinister or smart, new or cool as the film nonetheless made it look. But political economy or airport blockbusters about the CCP aren't really science. We already know that. So let's take an example that might come off as science to explain why I said, quote, ever since General Electric received the first ever patent on a bacteria in the 1980s, end of quote. When the Rockefeller Foundation at the turn of our millennium, some 20-30 years ago, began preparing the market introduction of one of the most highlighted GMO crops so far in history, the golden rice. It was seen as a disruptive discovery. Not so much because of the biosynthesized vitamin A precursor, beta-carotene, which is what makes the rice yellowish, though of course this is, this was the official scientific qualitative distinction, but rather because the two scientists they had recruited, who claimed that they always intended to share their discovery to humanity for free, was at this stage of the process told that the golden rice was not theirs to give away. I think Dr. Peter Bayer and Dr. Ingo Potriukus lies about what they know, but that is not what is important. What is important to illustrate this Marxist Hegelian point is that when the International Service for the Acquisition of Agri-Biotech Applications, the ISAAA, in 2000, laboriously deconstructed the legal aspects of the project, it turned out that Bayer and Potriukus infringed some 70 different patents and copyrights belonging to some 30 different companies. Each owned a small piece of the grain of rice. The big biochemical companies like DuPont and Monsanto held patents on the various maize genes and daffodil genes contained in the variety, while Japanese beer manufacturer Kirin held a patent on the bacterium used, etc., etc. And that is how the bourgeoisie, which is not a unified class, never forget, nonetheless manages to see eye to eye enough to engage with scientific research, and those of economic elasticity enough to see it through all the way, has to be among the world's richest. For Ford and Rockefeller began the fundamental research of that rise in the 50s, and the practical research in the 80s. And they didn't know they were going to hit gold in this way half a century later. And at the end of the day, which sees nothing new under the sun, the vitamin A boost is less than negligible compared to a balanced non-monocultural diet. But the 70 patents and the spontaneous joint economic interest of 30 big biotech conglomerates nonetheless made it into an economically interesting commodity, or should we say scientific discovery. Now, I'm sure many of us have already more than once contemplated the spontaneous critique that Rockefeller et al. Was never up to the task, but we might scratch our heads at their willingness to recently admit it. However, something tells me they still have a couple of horses in the race for nonetheless doing so. That's why I'm suspicious of the conclusions of Sabine's critique, which is a pre-Marxist humanist approach of alienation. She paraphrases Graeber's bullshit jobs and suggests the term bullshit research, which is fine and everything, even highly compatible with my own investigation, but again, such unstructured humanist critique is also useful for the public relations of the enemy. They have betted on that horse of alienation more than once and come out victorious. This series will investigate some of the real causes, but let's analyze the shortcomings of the alienation explanation. For example, during the COVID pandemic, an organization was founded which Elon Musk and the Chan Zuckerberg initiative gave a lot of money to. It attempted to streamline the process by which biomedical scientists can receive grants from private and public backers, called Fast Grant, which I don't know much about as to how well they lived up to their stated goals, but which, interestingly enough, in a somewhat separate survey of scientists, found that, quote, 78% of the respondents would change their research agenda a lot if they could, end of quote. Though of course we can't trust this number, I think we can safely say, under the current order of things among bourgeois scientists, the vast majority of them feel that they are alienated from the products of their own labor. Geez. I wonder how that came about and what system might have caused that, even for the highly skilled workforce. But again, why are terrible labor buyers of those highly skilled individuals like Musk and Zuckerberg highlighting that? Let's return to the contemporary shitstorm unfolding in America for clues. As we approach the end of today's much extended intro to the overall thema of the third season as a whole, let's recall that Gates, Bezos, Musk, Thiel, Eichmann, or whatever the OpenAI guy is called, have spent an awful lot of their public appearances in the last decades to precisely complain about the alienation of the self-made man. The fault, whether explicit or implicit, is of course always bureaucracy.
This is the chainsaw for bureaucracy. Chainsaw!
Bill Gates, who is no Ford or Rockefeller, has nonetheless been in the game a lot longer than the unhinged newcomers and has already been doing the work of the Department of Government Efficiency for decades. As described in a book by Diane Ravitch from 10 years ago called Region of Error, The Hoax of the Privatization Movement and the Danger to American Public Schools, Gates already began this propaganda campaign in the early 2000s, saying that the American education system is obsolete and broken. And in 2010, as part of his multi-billion-dollar project to create a small private state within the states, he released his propaganda film called Waiting for Superman, which explained why he was Superman and why the American educational system needs a new class of technocrats to take over the various functions of the state. With no shortage of money to make this look like a good idea, it was featured on the cover of Time magazine. The film was also then the centerpiece of a week of programming on NBC, which the network called Education Nation, as well as the subject of 2 programs on Oprah Winfrey's popular television show, as is to be expected. And it's not just Gates or the famous technocrats. In an anthology of last year called World of the Right, Radical Conservatism and Global Order, the authors argues, according to themselves, in a Gramscian way, that what unifies the new crypto-fascist parliamentarian right wing has all over the world, be it in Modi's India, Orban's Hungary, Le Pen's France, or Jimmy Åkesson's Sweden, etc., returned to its traditional Weimar critique of a global managerial class that needs to be overthrown. They don't call them Jews yet, but, sometimes maybe it's the Jews. According to one author in an interview, quote, in Europe, they are even trying to set up new universities. At the forefront of this initiative is Viktor Orban's Hungary, where at least 2 new universities have been established explicitly to educate and train the new radical right elite. The radical right is an anti-elitist only insofar as the elite is schooled in old liberal values. Another example is from France, where Marion Maréchal, the niece of Marine Le Pen, has set up a school in Lyon dedicated to training a new ultra-conservative elite. There are many more. These various institutions and universities are networked and have partnership with elite institutions around the world. End of quote. According to another of the authors in the same interview, quote, Gramsci talks about 2 types of wars, a war of maneuver and a war of position. A war of maneuver is the storming of the Bastille. A war of position, by contrast, is trench warfare that takes time, decades even. It is a slow march through the institutions, including political institutions, but perhaps more importantly, institutions of culture, such as the media, the arts, publishing houses, and educational institutions. This war of position is where we see the radical right shining within and between nations. There's a unity of purpose here that it didn't exist before. It was inspired by the French New Right, and it spread from Western Europe into Eastern Europe and the United States, and now across the globe. In India, we have the head of the RSS, which is the country-based organization affiliated with the ruling BJP, using terms that are associated with this right-wing Gramscianism. End of quote. A third author, again, same interview, elaborates on this Gramscian point and says, quote, it is striking how many right-wing intellectuals in different parts of the world have explicitly turned to Gramsci. One of Jair Bolsonaro's principal influences, the philosopher Olavo de Carvalho, was called the Gramsci of Brazil. He set up his own series of online courses, and a number of men in Bolsonaro's government graduated from this program. The term culture war is often used and abused, but the radical right believes the culture must change in order for common sense to change, and only then will material politics change. You don't win elections at the ballot box, you win them by changing the way we think. End of quote. And they want us to think that it's always the public state which is at fault, never the actual managerial class of private billionaires who can pay for science. And insofar that NGOs are targeted right now in America, there is of course not much talk of the old classic philanthropists of that rotating door, Carnegie, Ford, DuPont, etc. Unless Musk retweets something sub-moronic, like suggesting that Rockefeller is actually funding the Antifa. Yes, of course. He's such an idiot. And even if he was serious, we should recognize that this critique, that Western science is collapsing, and collapsing fast, is also the critique of the modern princess, as Gramsci put it in his analysis of Machiavelli. The tech bros are hungry and they are getting ready to kill the old king. As we end this intro, let me explain something. One last thing about the modern princess, which they forgot to bring up in that book, as it is the most difficult and most communist point, which post-Marxist, often well-paid academics often have a big problem with theorizing when they make use of Gramsci, as it concerns political organization. Now, I don't know if all the authors of that anthology recognize themselves as post-Marxist, but I presume as much. For you see, the modern princess, the tech bros, and the old king, the federal state, is linked to Machiavelli's project for a citizen militia. The so-called companies of fortune were the mercenary armies led by condottieri, and the condottieri were the Italian captains contracted to command mercenary companies during the Middle Ages and multinational armies during the early modern period. They notably served European monarchs and popes during the Italian wars of the Renaissance and the European wars of religion, which roved Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries, and in numerous cases took power in the cities which employed them, and founded dynasties in the days before the federal nation-states or the people's republics. They often became the first banking families, and this is precisely why everyone of power now has begun minting their bitcoins, or in the case of the more anonymous and clever like Bill Gates, buying lands of aspired automated robotic food production, where perhaps these coins will be spent, though techno-feudal barter would probably still demand human serf labor of some kind. The dialectical crux here is, of course, that in Gramsci's writing, the modern prince is holographic and can also be the organized left. Not only this new historical bloc of tech bros and their private armies and their private currencies, or the biotech latifundistas in Ukraine who are right now stockpiling weapons paid for with American tax dollars. And the organized left's historical task can only be accomplished if, quote, the great mass of peasant farmers burst simultaneously into political life, end of quote. I think the reason why Gramsci says peasant farmers in this quote rather than the proletariat is because the proletariat is already class conscious and have already bursted into political life. And so I think we can read here class unconscious subjects rather than peasants to fit our contemporary analysis, as this latent Jacobinian force suddenly starts to resemble a communist party. As disenfranchised potential militias realize they would rather fight for the nationalization of the industry under the flag of their ancestors' modernist project than some fucking nerd with fake money. I think Gramsci is saying, don't be a sucker. Of course we need to be a bit Machiavellian to pull this off. The enemy doesn't follow the rules, so why should we? And I know of one contemporary Italian who recently demonstrated that he agrees with this when it comes to doing something about the state of biomedical science and its goods and services. Quoting Gramsci, the basic thing about the prince is that it is not a systematic treatment, but a quote-unquote live work, in which political ideology and political science are fused in the dramatic form of a quote-unquote myth. Before Machiavelli, political science had taken the form either of the utopia or of the scholarly treatise. Machiavelli, combining the two, gave imaginative and artistic form to this conception by embodying the doctrinal, rational element in the person of a condottieri, who represents plastically and quote-unquote anthropomorphically the symbol of the quote-unquote collective will, in order to represent the process whereby a given collective will directed towards a given political objective is formed. Machiavelli did not have recourse to long-winded arguments or pedantic classifications of principles and criteria for a method of action. Instead, he represented this process in terms of the qualities, characteristics, duties, and requirements of a concrete individual. Such a procedure stimulates the artistic imagination of those who have to be convinced, and gives political passions a more concrete form. End of quote. Dear listener, will Luigi become Gramsci's Machiavellian modern prince, dead or alive? I don't know. I don't make history. But it seems theoretically plausible to those of us who are pessimists because of intelligence, but optimists because of will. I first thought that the best way to get back on track was to begin by talking about the biopiracy of the Samhällskommando, which appeared in the last Lysenko series, which fell under eco-fascism. But then I started writing, and another topic appeared. Those storylines of those two series have practically merged by now as Rockefeller's Caltech moves further away into the darkness of this gnarly forest. I never seem to quite get there, but then time and time again I feel like I've always been in that glade. Shunryu Suzuki once said that true practice is like a fog. Quote, after you have practiced for a while, you will realize that it is not possible to make rapid, extraordinary progress. Even though you try very hard, the progress you make is always little by little. It is not like going out in a shower in which you know when you get wet. In a fog, you do not know when you are getting wet. But as you keep walking, you get wet, little by little. End of quote. So I try not to worry about Caltech's elusive nature as I catch at least one of their fruit flies here and there in every episode. And perhaps we will never really find the pond where the larva first brooded. In this season, we will hopefully reacquaint ourselves with some familiar villains like Fruit Fly Morgan, X-Ray Mueller, the Koltsov Mafia, Biopirate Brücher, and his crewmate Borlau. You have to admit, I should get paid more than most of the DC and Marvel writers because these character names are awesome. They're so good, right? And I wrote down some preliminary titles for upcoming episodes as I structured these coming months of work in my mind, which I would like to share with you. They are not in any particular order, and I'm certain things will change, but they nonetheless connote things I would like to cover one way or another. So yes, first, quote, SS Sammelkommando, UNESCO, or how modern biopiracy began, end of quote. It's a pretty interesting topic. That would at least be 2 episodes by my my own standards. And then, quote, the Darwin they made you forget, Yong Sheng Liu's discovery, end of quote. Again, this is probably 3 episodes because this is one of the few works where I still have like big stacks of paper that I printed at the printer of my last work, where I could print for free, and it's like it's a good 700 pages, like in a big in a good stack that I feel like belongs to this particular topic alone, and I think 700 pages will make at least 2 or 3 episodes. Then, quote, a letter to Stalin, or how to guard a seed bank, end of quote. And here, of course, I'm thinking about, I kept alluding to it for the last 2nd season of Ecofascism, that X-Ray Mueller did in fact send a letter to Stalin, and he wrote a book in sort of, I don't know, like in the vibe of like Julian Huxley's brother Aldous Huxley's work, A Brave New World, right? Like he wrote, like, so Aldous Huxley obviously had a lot of conversation with Julian Huxley about, like, you know, the prospect of eugenics during the 1920s and the 1930s and the early 1900s before that. In which sort of, I would imagine, his brother laid out his own vision to him, and then Aldous Huxley took some psychedelic and sort of envisioned his brother's work and had some things to say about it. And I think, like, maybe even, you know, what makes A Brave New World a lot better book than 1984 is that it's not entirely apparently clear as to what is bad and what is good in that story. Like in 1984, the distinction is obvious, which is why it's a much more famous novel, right? Like, and then people have gone on to talk, oh, is it a critique of Stalinism? Oh, is it a critique of capitalism? Or, like in the most basic terms, right, is it a critique of non-veganism, right? Like, because it takes place on a farm in a way. But never mind that, because I think what my claim will be here is that A Brave New World and 1984 are well-known novels that, like, I think most of us have read, or at least we know what they are about, and we have maybe even some opinion whether we read them or not, because they reappear so often in, like, commentaries of academic papers or filmatizations, or, you know, like, just it's like an echo in the zeitgeist of the culture industry, right? But the letter that X-Ray Mueller sent to Stalin and the book that he made about it, like the sci-fi book that he wrote, most people have never read. And I think that something will appear there. Like, that's, I mean, at least that's my hope. Like that there's gotta be some stuff in it, some symptoms, and we're gonna find out just how the winning side envisioned their victory before they won it, right? And I think that is maybe even more productive than to point out in what way Lysenko is forthcoming or shortcoming or whatever. Like, I want to know what the victors thought their victory was going to be like. I think that is the most important thing to study in this regard. But still, even having said that, we also need, and then this is another topic, quote, Lysenko's conference and Huxley's class war, end of quote. And here I'm referring to something I alluded to and even started to talk about, which is that like the 1949, if I remember correctly, Lysenko conference, the all-Union Lenin agricultural conference, something like that, when like Lysenko really put forward his theory after like, I don't know, like 20, 30 years in the game, and like this is, you know, the first, like that's the interesting thing, right? Like this takes place in 1949, and in 1948, like 1 year before, is the genetic conference in Sweden, when the looting, you know, by the SS, by the Øneheart, of the Russian Soviet experimental stations of genetics, like that Lysenko together with Vavilov controlled in the Soviet Union at the time, like the forefront of agro technical science. They had they stole all the work, and they brought it to Sweden. And so even before 1948, they had already started to work with this stuff. And, you know, the Sammelkommando, Mr. Brücher of the biopiracy, was given, you know, like a visa in Sweden. He lived there a healthy life, and he married a Swedish wife. And you can see him in the films from that conference. Like, I wrote a letter, an email to the archivists of that genetic conference, and they sent me the video, and they helped me point out like where Brücher appears. And so I know he was there, and I know that like he, you know, it's so fucked up, man. Like what the fuck? Like all like the international community of geneticists meets in Sweden in 1948, and they're supposed to sort of reconcile with the fact that they are in a way, like in a highway, so to speak, responsible for the German eugenic program. And here, of course, you can gradualize it whatever way you like, but it doesn't stop at Axion T4, like, you know, the extermination and the gassing of Down syndrome people, or people like myself who have psychosis or schizophrenia. But like the gassing of the Jews and the communists and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the, I don't know, you know, Freemasons, why not? Like, you know, all these categories are categories which we no longer recognize as medical categories, but simply ideological, political, philosophical categories of human beings. But they still did gas them to death because they thought that they proposed a threat to the stock of the people. Like there was no distinction to them, you know. Whether you're a schizophrenic or a communist makes no difference to a Nazi. you're an insane person and you need to be eliminated for the good of the race. Like, what do you think? You think there's more dexterity than that in the appreciation of a Nazi doctor? No, there is not. They are the same thing. And the geneticists were responsible for that because they gave them the reason to think like this. And when they met in Sweden in 1948, they should have, obviously, self-critiqued themselves. And they should have begun a purge of fucktards who thought like that within their ranks. But they did not. Instead, the whole conference was hosted by Swedish representatives who were in agreement, direct agreement with the Nazi project, what Swedish bourgeois historians today call Friends of Germany, which is code for full-blood Nazis. And like, you know, the fact that this took place, yes, there were certain certain Jewish scientists in the world who refused to go to the conference, with all due respect. Like, they should have done that. And of course the Soviet Union also refused, because fuck me, you've killed, in a eugenical program, you've killed off 11 to 21 million Slavs in a sort of eugenical European program just now to better the stock on the bog standard of genetics. And you expect us to come and mingle with you? And then still the historians are like, oh, they did it because Lysenko didn't believe in genetics. I mean, man, come on. Like, whatever it is what you thought genetics was the most offensive thing that has ever existed in history. It doesn't matter what Lysenko thought or not. Your unashamed, pride is what eliminated certain individuals to join your conference in Sweden in 1948. And so, this having taken place, and this being a fact of history, that this did take place, made sure that in 1949 Lysenko organized the conference together with Stalin and others, which was the all-Union Lenin Agricultural Conference. I can't quite remember right now the exact naming of it. And sort of declared, class war against these people, like against bourgeois science, because clearly they don't give a fuck about what they have done. They still pretend like they can act as if we're just science, and whatever the Nazis did, and the fact of the matter that Julian Huxley, the founder of UNESCO, our leader, and the rest of them talking about mutations and X-rays and everything, the fact that they also supported eugenics, and that they supported like the social Darwinism and the fundamental research of this whole entire program, and that this entire program was simply the practical execution of what they have said in their own theoretical works, that didn't bother them. It seemed like it didn't even concern them, because they don't care about us, Like, they would rather make a point about Lysenko's supposed, Lamarckian interpretations, even though Lysenko never said that he was a Lamarckian. But that's how they felt about it, and they felt like, on an academic level, the distinction between Darwin and Lamarck, which was a dispute from the 1850s, like it's 100-year, or at least 100-year-old dispute about things that we still to this day cannot even fully explain. Things that are still a debate today. They felt like that was what we should discuss in 1948. Of course it wasn't. You should have looked at yourself, and you should have wondered whether you did a mistake by saying that these people did not deserve to live. Because that's what you said, Huxley, in your propaganda videos to the English public, the British public. You said that. I've watched your fucking videos, man. And then you got on to found the UNESCO, and the United Nations embraced it. And UNESCO was allowed to speak on behalf of bourgeois, or what you called world science. And you made a manifesto of race, quote unquote. That's literally like the title, like the manifesto of race. And then people did not even agree with it. The members of the geneticist community were split, half and half. Some still believed what the Nazis had believed. On an official level, they said there are still distinctions on a genetic level between the races, and some are inferior and some are superior. And whatever the Nazis did, we don't mind, but eventually we will have to deal with this problem again. And how do you think they would deal with it? It's a matter of population control. And that's why some people are still starving, man. You think it's an accident? Think it's an accident that people starve? No, they want them to starve. They scientifically decided that they deserve to starve to death in these meetings. And that's why I put it Huxley's class war, right? But that was not all that was born out of this. It was not all that was born out of this meeting in Sweden, or the counteraction by Lysenko 1 year later to draw a clear distinction line between proletarian science and bourgeois science. Because they don't want us to live, man. These upper classes, they are a minority, so they hate the majority. They hate us. They don't like us. They don't like the populace. They don't like population as such. They want to be a handful of people on a fucking rocket ship to Mars. This is the same thing happening right now. They don't need us. They don't want us. They don't believe that we are an asset to their wealth, even though we are. We built all their things. We researched all their things. We transported all their things from one place to another to make sure that capitalism exists. And that is what Mao pointed out. He said that the population is an asset. More people means more wealth. That is the basic line. That is the basic anti-Malthusian line of this fucking problem. And we need to teach ourselves. And we need to teach ourselves. We need to research. We need to learn more. Because it speaks to the basic instincts of our Nazism. Even when I lived with my grandmother, she said the same thing in a heated debate. You know, half down a wine box. And I could see in her eyes that she felt ashamed that that was her answer to my argument, you know. She was ashamed of that answer. I could see it in her eyes, and she blushed, and I've never seen her blush before. But she didn't know better, and she knew that she didn't know better. And so we need to know better. We need to know that that's not the case. It's not as simple as that. We are not too many people. And being too many isn't the problem. It's the organization of the resources which is the problem. I don't know where the threshold goes, but it doesn't matter. Because the major problem is the distribution of resources.
Real problem is this, James. 2 decades, there will be 7 billion human beings on this planet. Most of them brown, yellow, or black. All of them hungry. All of them determined to love. They'll swarm out of their breeding grounds into Europe and North America. Hence Vietnam. An all-out effort there will give us control of South Asia for decades to come. And with proper planning, we can reduce the population to 550 million by the end of the century. I know. I've seen the data.
We sound rather like gods reading the Doomsday Book, don't we?
Well, someone has to do it. Not only will the nations affected be better off, but the techniques developed there can be used to reduce our own excess population. Blacks, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, poverty-prone whites, and so forth.
Yeah. And so, the next topic that I thought that we could consider is Yankee Corn Khrushchev, a first international speculator. And so I'm talking here about like something that we will get into today, which is the beginning of monoculturalization, which is hybrid corn and the F1 varieties of seeds, you know, which if you're not a farmer, you don't know this, but like there are some seeds which you can't keep. There are some seeds which you can only buy. And if you grow them, there will be a healthy plant. But the seeds from that plant, it will not have the same characteristics as the plants of those seeds which you bought. And so in order to have the same yield next year, unfortunately, you have to go back to the seller of seeds. And we will see today, at least the beginning of how that came about. And Khrushchev was very interested in this, because Khrushchev had a very different understanding of what the socialist state's activity or purpose was than, let's say, Lysenko or Stalin. And he was, in a way, the very first international speculator, because the Soviet Union, when it joined the international speculation market under Khrushchev on the basis of agricultural produce, it had never happened before. And it was such a major player that it did disrupt the entire international speculation market. And it is an interesting story, and I have to get more into it because, yeah, a lot has been written about Khrushchev, but not too much have been written about it in this way, as a kind of in-between person, like a kind of Yeltsin character, I guess, in a way. Like, I mean, there are levels of cynicism. You know, Khrushchev and Brezhnev still operated under the appearance of socialism, which is important. I think appearances matters, and to still have, you know, like a utopia, whether how false it is or not, is one thing. You know, as long as, like, you know, as long as you allow the hammer and the sickle to burn bright for all the oppressed people of the world who are still under colonial control, that's one thing. But to say that it is false, like Yeltsin did, and to try to bash to pieces the dream of all these subaltern, sub-proletarian people in the colonial world in their fight against the oppressors of the West, and to say that this is a hopeless dream and that we ought to just accept the demands of the IMF and the World Bank and the Yankees. That is another level of cynicism that Khrushchev and Brezhnev could never even have imagined, even though they were backstabbers in many ways. And so that's another topic cleared. Now, I keep saying here that we will get into corn in this episode, but I mean this season. The children of the parapolitical corn, so named. Furthermore, the next episode will begin to adhere to some kind of chronology, which will take us to the days of the American Civil War and quickly move towards the infamous Dust Bowls, as that is once again on the global agenda for those who have been paying attention, and as such will not be able to reach Khrushchev for a couple of episodes. Another topic that I have begun to write and record already, considering recent development in the Contemporary East European Conflict is the Biological Peace and Warfare Season 3, the Holodomor Files, which I promised more than a year back, I believe. I don't know if all of these so far mentioned topics will get their own season or if I can manage to bundle them together somehow, but this topic, that of the Nazi Ukrainian American mythology, should be hefty enough to fill its own season. I also don't know if I'll be able to produce them simultaneously side by side, since I've got other projects going on with Matt and with Cloney. But if I can, then maybe we'll do one on the free tier and one on the Patreon tier. Just wanted to let you know. Another one I thought would be robot crickets, stridulations at DARPA. And this is like one of my most understudied topics, which is like, I have alluded again and again to the robotization. I've made, and this was inspired by French Marxist agriculturalists in the 90s and the early 2000s, who sort of organized, the various revolutions that has taken place in agriculture, like the first and the second, like between early agriculture, like from the Sumerians and the Egyptians, to the early mechanized revolutions of like mechanized, like the early technical revolutions of the plow, and then the ard first, and then the plow, and then the process of fallowing to reproduce cattle, and sort of like animals taking over the labor necessary to produce agricultural productivity away from humans, which took place primarily in Europe, in the way that I see it. And then of course the industrial revolution, insofar like this revolution, the revolution that I just spoke of, would make possible the industrial revolution. But then in a dialectical fashion, of course, the industrial revolution also made possible the industrial reproduction of agricultural means of production. And so it goes back again, and it sort of feeds itself in a strange way all the way up until around the 40s and the 50s, when we have the beginning of the Green Revolution, and we also have the motorization of agriculture, which is another qualitative jump in the history of agricultural revolutions. And then, of course, now towards the end of the 1900s and the times that we are in right now, we have the introduction of like GMOs and the patenting of seeds, but above all else, perhaps the not only automation of agriculture, but the robotization of agriculture, which, I mean, they are in a way like same, like that. Once you have motorized agriculture, you want them to run by themselves, and they, it's quite simple coordinates in a way for machines to just go up and down a field and harvest. Like there's not that much to do for a farmer who operates these kind of latifundias to just go to the end of his field and then go back again with the thresher. And so, of course, they want to robotize it, and they want to automate it in a different way. And at the same time, they want to collect data about grain yields, and because data is value within the capitalist system, insofar that you can speculate upon agricultural commodities in the same way that Khrushchev hoped that he would be able to do, unlike any other interessance on the international market, because of course the Soviet Union is one big huge player. If the whole of Soviet Union decides to grow corn, and Khrushchev is the first to receive the data about corn harvest of the Soviet Union, then surely he should be the most informed to make good speculations about it. And indeed, there are some interesting incidents in the 70s after Khrushchev's defeat, where the Soviet Union did make interesting agricultural speculation deals on the world market. Like there is the great wheat heist, I think, of the 70s, for example, which I hope we will talk about, which terrified the Americans. But more about that in the future. Just going through the titles here, right? Then Caesar Wilhelm in A Silent Autumn, the glyphosate files. And so I would hope that this would be like, everybody knows about Silent Spring, and so I wanted to make like an episode about A Silent Autumn and how like glyphosate has affected, well, the Americans above all else, because like they're really the ones who have made the most use of it. But now Chinese, at least some forces within China, are trying to implement it as well. There are interesting microbial questions to be raised about the use of glyphosate, insofar that it wasn't introduced as a herbicide initially by Monsanto, I think, in the 80s, which is what it is known as today. It is the most used herbicide and biocide in contemporary industrial agriculture, as far as I understand it. But it was never introduced as such. It was introduced as a antibiotic. And there's something interesting about that, because it disrupts certain, even though it has been declared safe for humans, just like DDT was, a generation or 2 generations earlier, which is the topic of Silent Spring. My episode about Silent Autumn would then be about how glyphosate nonetheless does have an effect on human beings, especially with regards to like the microbial and the gut flora in human beings. And maybe we will be able to answer the big question, which is that why is it, for example, that like Americans who are basically Europeans, like on a genetic level, why is it that they are to a much larger degree gluten intolerant than Europeans? And why is it that when Americans go, like those who can afford it, when they go on trips to Europe and they have pizza, they have pasta, lasagna, or like all the wheat heavy dishes that we have to provide here in Europe, why do they not feel sick when they come to Europe? Why is there no gluten intolerance for gluten intolerant Americans in Europe? And maybe glyphosate is a big explainer for those things. You have the exact same thing in the north of Finland, for example, on the border of Russia, where you can measure, like a village separated by, 10 miles. One is on the western Finland side, and one is on the eastern Russian side, and they are the exact same, basically. On a geographical level, they are the exact same wheat fields, but you have an immense explosion of allergies on the Finnish side, which you don't have on the Russian side, because of certain restrictions on these kind of IG-farben chemicals. And I would really like to highlight that, and I would like to get into that and see what that is all about. Now, the intro was long, and this secondary intro was long, and I feel like if you made it this far because you are a recurring listener, that means that you enjoy what I'm doing. And I hope you'll also consider becoming a member on Patreon, where you can support this work so that this topic eventually get their deep dive. And I don't know, if you don't feel like you have the amount of money to give me a coffee or a beer, I don't use all my money for coffee or beer. I use it for other things as well. But like, I don't know, like this is the social equivalent that I've seen some people use, and I don't know, it makes sense because you usually do buy a coffee for another person, or you do buy beer for another person. I understand that you might accumulate these fees over time, and that you maybe are a student and you want to cut down on these fees insofar as they are like, you know, monthly payments. Then maybe you can drop a comment. And you know, like if you do become a patron, you can even ask questions, etc. And like some of the best comments are on the Patreon, and some of the most insightful conversations are going on there, I think, of people who want to ask me things and who want me to focus more deeply on things that they have noticed, or people who want to thank me for enlightening them on something that they, you know, walked just right by past them. Yeah. And I thought that, well, I mean, if you're among those who have said such things and commented, and you are already a patron, then of course, thank you so much. I hope you're doing good. I really do. And I think, you know, like I'm looking forward to this spring because I'm so excited about what I'm going to do at the farm. And having talked about Lysenko last year and vernalization, and talked about microbial solutions, I have increased my enthusiasm for putting this into practice. And I want to maybe film a bit about it and document it in various ways. And maybe I'll put something up on the Patreon as well. And I just want to thank everybody who made sure that I keep the fire lit enough to spend my time researching this and writing about it. Of course, without you, I wouldn't have done that. I would have just done something else, and I would have felt like somebody will deal with that in the future.